The first rays of morning, pale and hesitant, slipped through the thin floral curtains of Alina Reyes's rented bedroom. She stirred beneath the worn cotton sheets, a sigh escaping her lips as she stretched, the lingering ache of a long day settling in her muscles. Rubbing the sleep from her eyes, her gaze drifted automatically to the small time-worn photo frame perched on her nightstand. Inside, a faded snapshot captured her life across an ocean. Her two young children, Maya and Ben, their faces beaming with the unrestrained joy of childhood, even against the backdrop of their simple provincial home in the Philippines. Their smiles were a constant pull, a silent promise. Alina traced the outline of Maya's cheek with a gentle finger, then Ben's mischievous grin. She pressed a soft kiss to the cool glass, whispering in Tagalog, "Para sa inyo ito, mga anak." This is for you, my children. Her day, like every day for the past 2 years, was dedicated to that promise. It began with the familiar comforting ritual of a quiet breakfast, a small mound of steamed rice, fragrant and pearly white, topped with a fried egg, its yolk a sunny yellow eye staring back at her. Fuel for the day. Then, she would step out into the still cool California air and begin her commute to a world vastly different from her own. Alina was a caregiver, a profession that demanded both strength and tenderness, and her current charge was Mr. Arthur Whitmore, the aging patriarch of a family whose name echoed in the hushed, manicured avenues of Southern California's wealthiest enclaves. 2 years prior, a stroke had stolen Mr. Whitmore's physical vitality, leaving him frail but thankfully, his mind, sharp as ever, remained a flickering beacon, especially when Alina was near. As the bus lumbered to a stop near the Whitmore estate, Alina felt the familiar pang of contrast, a sharp intake of breath against the sheer opulence that lay before her. The sprawling grounds were a testament to curated wealth, a stage set for a life she could only glimpse from the periphery. Manicured lawns stretched like emerald carpets, interrupted only by the baroque flourish of a towering fountain, its water cascading in shimmering arcs, and the imposing grandeur of marble columns that seemed to guard the entrance. It was a world designed to inspire awe, and perhaps, Alina mused with a quiet irony, to subtly intimidate those who, like herself, arrived each day from a different reality. She took a deep breath, the scent of jasmine and manicured grass filling her lungs, and straightened her shoulders. Remember why you are here, Alina. The silent mantra was a shield against the unspoken judgments, the subtle divides. Family first. Inside the grand, echoing house, the atmosphere was invariably cool, bordering on glacial. Despite the plush furnishings and the hushed elegance, there was a palpable absence of warmth, of lived-in comfort. The Whitmore children, Mark, Evelyn, Nathan, and Claire, all adults now, with lives that pulsed with a relentless self-absorbed energy, were infrequent visitors to their father's sprawling domain. They had delegated his care entirely to Alina, as if Mr. Whitmore himself were a delicate, inconvenient package to be outsourced, a problem best handled by hired hands. For them, she suspected, he was less a father, more a responsibility, a box to be ticked on a never-ending list. "Good morning, Mr. Whitmore," Alina greeted, her voice bright and cheerful, a deliberate spark of warmth in the cavernous bedroom. The old man, framed by the vast window overlooking the meticulously sculpted garden, sat in his wheelchair, a solitary figure against the backdrop of sculpted greenery. But the moment his gaze landed on Alina, his face, etched with the map of years and illness, softened, a faint light flickering in his pale blue eyes. "Ah, Alina, my sunshine," he said, his voice a whisper, weakened but still carrying a thread of genuine warmth. "Come, sit. Tell me about your family today." Alina chuckled softly, a genuine sound that momentarily chased away the house's pervasive chill. She moved to help him towards the breakfast table, her touch gentle and practiced. "They are doing well, Pa," she replied, using the respectful Filipino term of address. "My daughter, Maya, she just started high school. She says she wants to be a nurse someday." "A nurse, Mr. Whitmore teased gently, a twinkle returning to his eye. "Like you, Alina?" Alina's cheeks flushed a delicate rose. "Oh, not like me, Pa. I never finished my degree." A familiar pang of regret, quickly suppressed. "But she will. She is determined." Her voice, though quiet, resonated with an unwavering strength, the kind forged in the crucible of sacrifice and unwavering hope. Mr. Whitmore nodded, his gaze thoughtful, distant for a moment. "She's lucky to have you, Alina. Not many people would work this hard for their family." The unspoken words hung in the air. "Unlike my own children." As Alina deftly prepared his breakfast, the bland, prescribed fare, She listened with practiced patience to Mr. Whitmore's stories. He often drifted back to the past, to the vibrant tapestry of his youth, his business triumphs, and the enduring love he held for his late wife Miriam. Today, however, a different note colored his reminiscences. He was quieter, more introspective. "Alina," he began softly, breaking the comfortable silence that had settled between them, "do you ever feel like the world doesn't really see you? Like you're invisible?" The question, so unexpected, so personal, caught Alina completely off guard. Her hand paused mid-air, a spoonful of scrambled eggs hovering above the plate. She lowered it slowly, considering his words, the weight of them settling in the quiet room. "Sometimes, Pa," she admitted, her voice barely above a whisper, "but I don't mind. As long as I'm doing good for my family. That's what matters." The simple truth, spoken without self-pity, without expectation of recognition. Mr. Whitmore studied her intently, his gray eyes, clouded with age, filled with an emotion she couldn't quite decipher. Pity? Respect? Something deeper, perhaps. "You're a remarkable woman, Alina," he said finally, his voice thick with sincerity. "Don't you ever let anyone tell you otherwise." Her cheeks warmed again, a deeper blush this time, tinged with a faint unease. She busied herself with tidying the breakfast table, the clinking of silverware a small distraction. Compliments, especially those that acknowledged her worth beyond her role as a caregiver, always felt foreign, almost unsettling. Her work, her quiet devotion, so often went unnoticed, unacknowledged by the rest of the Whitmore family, lost in the vastness of their privileged world. As the day unfolded, Alina moved through the sprawling house with a quiet, almost ethereal efficiency. She tended to Mr. Whitmore's needs with an intuitive grace, anticipating his wants before they were even voiced. She hummed softly under her breath, fragments of Tagalog folk songs, melodies from her childhood that wrapped around her like a comforting shawl. For Alina, this was never just a job, a means to an end. It was a calling, a quiet act of rebellion against the cold indifference of the world, a chance to infuse warmth and dignity into the life of someone who had been, in a way, left behind, adrift in the currents of familial neglect. Little did Alina suspect, as she navigated the hushed hallways and sun-drenched rooms, that her quiet acts of compassion, her unseen devotion, were subtly setting the stage for a life-altering event, a quiet revolution that would challenge everything she thought she knew about herself, and the world that had so often rendered her invisible. The Whitmore estate held its breath in the mornings, a vast silence punctuated only by the gentle hum of Alina's purposeful activity. She moved through the echoing rooms like a whisper of wind, tidying, organizing, ensuring every detail was perfect, anticipating Mr. Whitmore's needs before he could even articulate them. Every polished surface, every meticulously placed objet d'art, seemed designed to impress, to project an image of flawless affluence. But beneath the veneer of luxury, a pervasive coldness lingered, an absence of genuine warmth, as if the house itself were a museum, admired but never truly lived in. Alina began her day by preparing Mr. Whitmore's breakfast. His dietary restrictions were severe. Low-sodium, heart-healthy meals that, while nutritionally sound, were devoid of the vibrant flavors he craved. Still, Alina, with her inherent Filipino resourcefulness, added subtle touches to make the food more palatable, more human. A sprinkle of finely chopped herbs, a delicate garnish of parsley, a careful arrangement of the bland components on the plate. "Egg whites again?" Mr. Whitmore grumbled good-naturedly as she placed the plate before him. "I miss frail food, Alina." She chuckled, her smile warm and genuine as she unfolded a crisp linen napkin onto his lap. "You'll thank me, Pa, when you're dancing at your great-granddaughter's wedding." He muttered, pushing at the eggs with his fork, but his eyes, Alina noticed, twinkled with amusement. She always had a way of coaxing a smile from behind his gruff exterior, a small victory in the face of his physical limitations and emotional isolation. After breakfast, Alina wheeled Mr. Whitmore into the sunroom, his favorite sanctuary. The room was bathed in the soft, diffused light filtering through floor-to-ceiling windows, a glass-walled haven overlooking the meticulously sculpted garden. Outside, the perfectly trimmed greenery stretched out like a living painting, a testament to manicured perfection. But to Alina, it was just another stark reminder of how profoundly disconnected the Whitmores were from the messy, vibrant reality of life. The garden wasn't for strolling, for children's games, for the simple joy of being in nature. It was for display, a silent pronouncement of status, a landscape of privilege. As Mr. Whitmore drifted into a light doze in his plush armchair, Alina allowed herself a moment to breathe, to momentarily step outside the confines of her role. She pulled out her phone, a lifeline to her world across the miles, and scrolled through the photos of her children. They had sent her a short video message last night, a shaky, pixelated clip of them singing a children's song they'd learned in school, their voices slightly off-key but brimming with innocent enthusiasm. The sound of their voices, tinny and precious, echoed in her mind, momentarily filling the void left by their physical absence. "Mommy misses you so much," she whispered in Tagalog, her voice thick with longing, tucking her phone back into her pocket, the digital connection a poor substitute for a real embrace. By mid-morning, Alina gently guided Mr. Whitmore through his physical exercises. She had learned basic physiotherapy techniques during her nursing training in the Philippines, knowledge that, while not explicitly part of her job description, she had quietly incorporated into her care. "Lift your arms, Pa. That's it. One more time. You're a tough one, Lolo," she encouraged, using a playful term of endearment, Grandpa. Mr. Whitmore chuckled, his breath coming in short, labored gasps, but his smile remained undimmed. "Only because I have a tough trainer, Alina." She winked, her eyes sparkling. "Of course, Pa. You need to stay strong. For that great-granddaughter's wedding, remember?" Later that day, the Whitmore family's pervasive indifference came into sharp, painful focus. Mr. Whitmore's son, Mark, stopped by for a fleeting visit. He was a vision of corporate success, impeccably dressed in an expensive suit, a phone permanently grafted to his ear, its incessant buzzing and chirping a constant intrusion. Alina barely managed a polite, "Good afternoon, sir," before he breezed past her, his gaze distant, preoccupied, mumbling something about a meeting running late. "Dad, I can only stay for 5 minutes," Mark announced, glancing impatiently at his Rolex, the glint of gold catching the light. "How are you feeling?" "Like a museum exhibit," Mr. Whitmore replied dryly, his voice laced with a familiar resigned sarcasm. "Everyone passes by, but no one stops to really look." Mark laughed, a short, awkward sound that held no genuine humor. Clearly, the subtle barb, the poignant undercurrent of loneliness in his father's words, was completely lost on him. "Well, glad you're doing okay. Gotta run." And with another cursory nod, he was gone, disappearing as quickly as he had materialized, leaving a vacuum of casual indifference in his wake. Alina watched him go, a familiar ache settling in her chest. Not even a flicker of acknowledgement, not a glance in her direction. She bit back a sigh, the familiar sting of invisibility, and focused instead on arranging the books Mr. Whitmore liked to read, straightening the spines, aligning them with meticulous care. In the afternoon quiet, Mr. Whitmore, sharp even in his frailty, noticed her subdued expression. He shook his head slowly, a silent understanding passing between them. "Don't let them get to you, Alina," he said softly, his voice a low rumble. "They don't see what's right in front of them." "It's okay, Pa," she replied, forcing a light, unconvincing smile, though the ache in her chest whispered a different story. "I'm here for you. That's all that matters." That evening, after settling Mr. Whitmore into bed, tucking the soft blanket around his thin shoulders, Alina quietly cleaned up the kitchen, preparing for the next day's routine. It was a rhythm she had mastered, a quiet symphony of patience, humility, and a deep, unwavering sense of duty. Yet, despite the bone-deep exhaustion that settled in her limbs each night, she found a quiet, profound purpose in her work. For Alina, every act of care, every gentle touch, was a silent prayer, a tangible way to honor her family, both near and impossibly far. As she turned off the lights, plunging the grand house into a deeper stillness, and stepped out into the crisp night air, she paused, tilting her face upwards. The stars, a million pinpricks of light against the vast, dark canvas of the sky, sparkled with a familiar brilliance, a comforting echo of home. She didn't know it yet, couldn't possibly imagine, that her unwavering dedication, her quiet acts of kindness, were about to ripple outwards, changing the course of her life in ways she could never have dreamed. It started, as so many significant shifts often do, with an ordinary afternoon, a quiet moment in a sun-drenched room. It started like any other afternoon. Alina had just finished helping Mr. Whitmore with his crossword puzzle, a daily ritual they both enjoyed, a gentle mental sparring match. A comfortable silence settled between them in the sunroom, sunlight streaming through the windows, warming the polished wood floor. He had a playful grin on his face, a mischievous glint in his eye, after stumping her with a clue about some obscure 1950s actor. "You're too young to know that one, Alina," he teased, his voice still carrying a trace of playful triumph. She laughed, a light melodic sound that filled the quiet space, shaking her head. Maybe pa. But you'll have to teach me these things, so I can keep up. But as Mr. Whitmore chuckled softly, the sound abruptly cut short. His expression shifted, a sudden alarming change that sent a jolt of fear through Alina. His face, moments before animated with amusement, went ashen, the color draining away, leaving his skin a sickly paper white. His body slumped forward in the wheelchair, a sudden, terrifying collapse. "Sir? Mr. Whitmore!" Alina cried, her voice sharp with alarm, rushing to his side. He was gasping, a ragged, shallow sound, his hand clutching desperately at his chest, his knuckles bone white. Panic surged through her, a cold wave threatening to engulf her, but years of ingrained discipline, the quiet strength she had honed over a lifetime of challenges, kicked in. She forced herself to breathe, to push back the rising tide of fear. Alina's training, the rudimentary nursing courses she had taken years ago in the Philippines, flickered back to life, a dormant knowledge suddenly vital. She reached for his wrist, her fingers finding the faint pulse, weak and erratic, a fluttering bird trapped beneath fragile skin. "Sir, stay with me," she urged, her voice firm but laced with urgency, grabbing her phone from her pocket, her fingers fumbling for the emergency number. Her hands trembled, betraying the fear that threatened to overwhelm her, as she spoke to the 911 operator, her voice strained but clear, explaining the situation, the address, the symptoms, relaying the vital information with a desperate precision. The operator's voice, calm and professional, assured her that help was on the way, but Alina knew with a chilling certainty that every second was precious, that minutes could mean the difference between life and death. With a strength born of adrenaline and desperate resolve, she eased Mr. Whitmore from the wheelchair, lowering him gently to the carpeted floor. And then, without hesitation, without a second thought for her own fear, she began performing CPR. Her hands, small but strong, pressed firmly against his chest in a rhythmic, life-giving motion. 1, 2, 3, 4, she counted aloud, her voice a steady anchor in the swirling vortex of panic, trying to block out the terror that clawed at the edges of her composure. Minutes stretched into an eternity, each compression a desperate plea, each breath she forced into his lungs a silent prayer. Alina was so intensely focused, so utterly consumed by the life-or-death struggle unfolding in front of her, that she didn't even register the distant wail of sirens, the flashing lights reflecting against the sunroom windows, until a hand gently touched her shoulder, pulling her back to the present. "We've got it from here, ma'am," a medic said, his voice calm and reassuring, his presence a sudden overwhelming relief. Alina stepped back, her body trembling, tears welling in her eyes, blurring her vision as the paramedics moved with practiced efficiency, their movements swift and coordinated. They worked to stabilize Mr. Whitmore, their voices low and professional, their actions precise and life-saving. As they carefully loaded him onto a stretcher, one of the paramedics paused, turning to Alina, a nod of respect in his eyes. "Your CPR. It likely saved his life," he said, his words matter-of-fact but carrying the weight of profound gratitude. "Good job." But there was no time to process the faint praise, no space for relief to take root. Adrenaline still coursed through her veins, a frantic energy driving her forward. Alina grabbed Mr. Whitmore's medical file from the nearby table, her mind racing ahead, anticipating the next steps, the next challenges. She followed the paramedics out of the grand house, the stretcher wheels rattling on the paved walkway, the flashing ambulance lights cutting through the tranquil suburban afternoon. As she waited in the sterile humming silence of the emergency room, her heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic drumbeat of worry. Would he make it? What would his family say? She knew they would arrive soon, drawn by the emergency, and she braced herself for their inevitable questions, their usual dismissiveness, the subtle unspoken chasm that separated their world from hers. The Whitmore family arrived an hour later, a whirlwind of hurried footsteps and hushed, anxious voices echoing through the sterile hospital hallway. Mark led the way, his expensive suit slightly rumpled, his expression a carefully constructed mask of concern, tinged with an undercurrent of barely concealed annoyance. Evelyn trailed behind him, her face pale and tight, followed by Nathan and Claire, their expressions a mixture of apprehension and mild curiosity. "What happened?" Mark demanded, his voice clipped, barely glancing at Alina, his focus already fixed on the closed doors of the emergency room. "He collapsed," Alina explained, her voice steady despite the lump of anxiety lodged in her throat. "It seemed like a heart issue. I performed CPR until the paramedics arrived." Mark nodded curtly, his gaze still averted, his attention elsewhere. But his wife, Evelyn, her voice sharp and accusatory, crossed her arms tightly across her chest. "Why didn't you call us sooner?" she questioned, the unspoken blame hanging heavy in the air. Alina swallowed her rising frustration, the familiar sting of being undervalued, of being seen as somehow responsible. "I called 911 immediately, ma'am," she replied, her voice even, controlled. "And I focused on keeping him alive. There wasn't time for anything else." Before Evelyn could retort, the doctor emerged from behind the emergency room doors. He was a tall man, his face etched with the weariness of countless hours, but his demeanor was calm, reassuring. His white coat flapped slightly as he approached them, a beacon of authority in the anxious space. "Mr. Whitmore is stable," he announced, his voice measured and professional. "It was a mild heart attack, but thanks to Alina's quick action, he's out of immediate danger." Mark and Evelyn exchanged a quick, almost imperceptible glance, their expressions still unreadable, a complex interplay of relief and something else, something colder, perhaps resentment. Alina stood silently, feeling as always, strangely invisible, a ghost in their privileged world. Yet, despite their unspoken judgments, the subtle currents of their disapproval, her only concern, the only weight in her heart, was Mr. Whitmore's recovery. "Can we see him?" Mark asked, his voice softening slightly, the edge of accusation momentarily smoothed away. "Just one at a time for now," the doctor replied, his gaze sweeping over the anxious faces. "He needs rest." Mark went in first, disappearing behind the closed door, leaving Alina and Evelyn in an awkward, charged silence. Evelyn finally spoke, her tone still sharp, laced with a dismissive condescension. "You're paid to take care of him," she stated, her words clipped, final. "Don't expect a medal for doing your job." Alina bit her lip, the familiar sting of injustice rising within her, but she said nothing. She wasn't seeking gratitude, wasn't expecting praise. She only wanted Mr. Whitmore to be okay. When finally, Alina got her chance to see him, she stepped into the quiet room, her heart lifting at the sight of him. Mr. Whitmore was pale, his skin translucent against the white sheets, but he was awake, his eyes, though still shadowed with fatigue, lit up with a familiar warmth when he saw her. "Alina," he murmured, his voice weak, barely audible. "Thank you." She smiled, a genuine radiant smile that chased away the lingering shadows of anxiety. Her heart swelled with a profound relief. "You're going to be fine, Pa," she reassured him, her voice soft and soothing. "Just rest." As she left his bedside, stepping back into the hushed hallway, Alina didn't realize that the wheels of fate, set in motion by her selfless act of compassion, were already turning, gathering momentum. Her quiet act of heroism, performed without expectation of reward, would soon spark a chain of events, a quiet revolution in the heart of the Whitmore family, that would irrevocably change her life, and theirs forever. The day after Mr. Whitmore's heart attack, his hospital room became a revolving door of medical activity. Doctors came and went, their voices low and professional as they checked vitals and reviewed charts. Nurses moved with practiced efficiency, adjusting 4 drips and monitoring machines that beeped and whirred, measuring the fragile rhythm of his recovering heart. But for Alina, the clinical chaos of the hospital ward was almost easier to navigate than the cold reception from the Whitmore family, a chill that permeated even the sterile air of the room. Mark and Evelyn had arrived early, accompanied by their 2 grown children, Nathan and Claire. They hovered around Mr. Whitmore's bedside, their voices pitched just above a whisper, their expressions carefully calibrated to convey concern. They asked the right questions, the rote inquiries about his well-being, his comfort level, his pain. But beneath the surface politeness, Alina sensed a hollowness, a lack of genuine warmth, of deep-seated care. It was a performance, she realized, a carefully staged tableau of filial duty. "How long does he need to stay here?" Mark asked the doctor, his tone more inconvenienced than worried, his gaze straying towards his watch. "A few days, depending on his recovery," the doctor replied, his voice measured. "We'll need to monitor him closely to prevent another incident." Evelyn frowned, her perfectly sculpted eyebrows drawing together in a thin line of displeasure. "A few days? That's going to mess up our schedule." Her words, spoken without a trace of empathy, felt like tiny daggers, pricking at Alina's quiet composure. But she bit her tongue, maintaining her silence, her invisibility. Mr. Whitmore, propped up against a mountain of pillows, his face still pale but his eyes clearer, glanced towards Alina, a faint, almost imperceptible smile gracing his lips. "I'll be fine," he said, his voice still raspy but regaining its usual strength. "Thanks to Alina. She saved my life." Mark's eyes flicked briefly towards her, a cursory glance that held no warmth, no gratitude, only a fleeting, almost resentful acknowledgement. "Yes, well, that's her job," he said dismissively, his words erasing her act of heroism, reducing it to a mere line item on her job description. "We'll handle things from here." Alina felt a sharp sting of frustration, the familiar ache of being unseen, unheard. But she nodded silently, accepting her place in their carefully constructed world, even if it felt profoundly unfair. Later that day, while Mr. Whitmore napped, Mark cornered Alina in the hallway, his approach abrupt, his tone businesslike. "Look," he began, his voice firm, bordering on condescending, "I appreciate what you did for my dad. Really. But let's not make a big deal out of this, okay?" Alina blinked, taken aback by his bluntness, his casual dismissal of a life-saving act. "I'm not trying to, sir," she replied, her voice quiet but steady. "I'm just here to care for him." "Good," Mark said, adjusting the cuff of his expensive shirt, his attention already drifting away. "Because the last thing we need is any drama. Just keep doing your job, and we'll be fine." He turned to leave, dismissing her with a wave of his hand, leaving Alina standing alone in the sterile hallway, his words hanging in the air like a cold draft. She nodded, swallowing the lump that had formed in her throat, the unspoken weight of his condescension settling heavily upon her. She wasn't sure why his words stung so acutely, why they resonated with such a profound sense of injustice. Perhaps it was because she had acted instinctively, without hesitation, risking everything in that moment to save Mr. Whitmore's life, without a single thought for herself, for the potential consequences. And now, it felt like none of it mattered, that her act of courage, her selfless devotion, was being reduced to a mere obligation, a professional transaction. Evelyn joined them, her expression as icy and unyielding as her husband's. "We'll need you to stay overnight," she stated, her tone leaving no room for discussion. "There's no point in us hiring someone else to fill in. You're already here." Alina's stomach twisted, a knot of unease tightening within her. Another night away from her own small apartment. Another night separated from the faint comfort of her children's photographs. But she forced a light professional smile, masking the weariness that threatened to overwhelm her. "Of course, ma'am." That evening, after the family had finally gone home, leaving behind a faint residue of their anxieties and unspoken judgments, the hospital room fell quiet, a hushed sanctuary in the bustling ward. Alina sat by Mr. Whitmore's bedside, her presence a silent vigil. She gently dabbed his forehead with a cool, damp cloth, her touch feather-light. His breathing was steady now, even, but he still looked fragile, diminished, a mere shadow of the lively, sharp-witted man she had come to know. "Alina," he whispered, his eyes barely fluttering open, his gaze seeking hers across the quiet space. "Yes, Pa," she responded softly, leaning closer. "Don't let them push you around," he said, his voice barely audible, a fragile whisper against the hushed backdrop of the hospital room. "You deserve more than this." Tears pricked at her eyes, a sudden rush of emotion threatening to spill over, but she blinked them away, forcing a reassuring smile. "Just focus on getting better, Pa," she murmured, her voice thick with unshed tears. "That's all that matters." As the hours stretched into the long silent night, Alina stayed by his side, a quiet sentinel in the dimly lit room. Her mind raced, a whirlwind of thoughts and anxieties. She had come to America with a singular purpose, to build a better life for her family, to provide them with opportunities she herself had been denied. And she had accepted the sacrifices that came with it, the long hours, the loneliness, the constant feeling of being an outsider. But deep down, beneath the layers of duty and resilience, a quiet question lingered, a persistent whisper in the silence of her heart. Would there ever come a time when someone truly saw her, not just as a caregiver, not just as a pair of capable hands, but as a person, as Alina Reyes, a woman of strength, compassion and unwavering worth? What Alina didn't realize, as she sat there in the quiet darkness, was that this very moment of quiet humility, this unspoken yearning for recognition, would soon lead to a profound revelation, a seismic shift in her life's trajectory. Her compassion, her quiet strength, were about to leave an impact far greater, far more transformative, than she could have ever imagined. 3 days after the heart attack, Mr. Whitmore was finally discharged from the hospital, wheeled out through the grand, revolving doors of the institution and back into the waiting embrace of his estate. Alina guided his wheelchair, his frail frame bundled in a soft, cashmere blanket against the slight chill of the morning air. The family was gathered in the foyer, their hushed conversation ceasing abruptly as they turned to greet their returning patriarch. "Dad, are you feeling okay?" Mark asked, a slight strain in his voice, a hint of discomfort in his stiff posture. He stood awkwardly, as if ill at ease with the visible vulnerability of his father, with a stark reminder of mortality that Mr. Whitmore's illness had brought into their carefully controlled lives. "I'm alive, aren't I?" Mr. Whitmore quipped, a flicker of his old humor returning, though his voice was still noticeably weaker, thinner than usual. His gaze, however, drifted past his son, seeking out Alina, who stood quietly behind the wheelchair, her presence almost unnoticed by the rest of the family. "Thanks to her," he added, his voice firm, his gaze unwavering as it rested on Alina. Mark cleared his throat, a sound that spoke volumes of his discomfort, his desire to deflect, to minimize. "Yes, well, let's get you settled," he said briskly, ushering his father towards the elevator, effectively ending the conversation, erasing Alina's contribution with a wave of his hand. The following days at the estate were quieter, subdued. Mr. Whitmore needed rest, a slow, measured convalescence, and the family, perhaps sensing the awkwardness of lingering too long, of facing the unspoken truths that Mr. Whitmore's illness had brought to the surface, seemed to retreat, to avoid the house, to return to the familiar rhythms of their own self-absorbed lives. Alina, however, remained a constant presence, a quiet anchor in the swirling currents of the Whitmore household. She resumed her usual routine, ensuring Mr. Whitmore took his medications on time, gently guiding him through his physical therapy exercises, and bringing him his favorite Earl Grey tea, its delicate aroma a small comfort, a familiar ritual to soothe his frayed nerves. One afternoon, as soft sunlight filtered through the windows of the sunroom, casting long shadows across the polished floor, Mr. Whitmore motioned for Alina to sit beside him. She hesitated for a moment, a lifetime of ingrained deference making her wary of overstepping boundaries. This wasn't typically allowed, this informal intimacy, this shared space beyond the designated caregiver-patient dynamic. But his firm gaze, unwavering and insistent, left her no choice. She settled into the chair beside his wheelchair, her posture still slightly formal, her hands clasped loosely in her lap. "Do you ever think about what you're worth, Alina?" he asked suddenly, his voice quiet but direct, his piercing gaze fixed upon her face. She blinked, startled by the unexpected question, by its personal, almost probing nature. "What do you mean, Pa?" she asked hesitantly, unsure where he was leading. "I mean," he said, shifting slightly in his wheelchair, his gaze still intense, "do you know how valuable you are? To me? To the world? Or has life convinced you that you're just replaceable?" Her throat tightened, a knot of emotion constricting her voice. It wasn't a question she could easily answer, not without delving into depths she rarely allowed herself to explore. I try not to think about it, Pa," she stammered, her gaze dropping to her hands. "I focus on what I can do for others. On my family." Mr. Whitmore studied her for a long moment, his eyes filled with something she couldn't quite place, a complex mixture of emotions. Admiration, perhaps, tinged with a hint of guilt, a shadow of regret. "You shouldn't have to prove your worth through sacrifice, Alina," he said finally, his voice thick with emotion. "The people who matter, they'll see it. Without you having to show them." Alina's heart ached at his words, a deep, resonant ache that spoke to a lifetime of unspoken longings, of quiet sacrifices. But she didn't respond, couldn't find the words to articulate the complex web of emotions that his simple statement had unearthed. She had spent so much of her life pouring herself into the lives of others, defining herself through her service, her caregiving, that the very idea of being seen, of being valued for who she truly was, felt almost foreign, unsettlingly unknown. Unbeknownst to Alina, while she had been focused solely on Mr. Whitmore's care, on his slow, steady recovery, he had been busy behind the scenes, a quiet orchestrator of change. He had started making phone calls, his voice regaining strength with each passing day, first to his lawyer, then to his financial advisor, his instructions firm, Unwavering. He insisted on handling these affairs himself, personally overseeing every detail, even though his family, sensing a shift in the power dynamics, would have preferred to delegate everything, to maintain their control, their carefully constructed narrative of familial authority. One evening, as Alina helped him into bed, carefully adjusting his pillows, ensuring he was comfortable, he looked at her, his gaze holding an intensity she hadn't witnessed before, a depth of emotion that went beyond mere gratitude. "You've given me more than anyone else has in years, Alina," he said, his voice low and resonant, carrying a weight of unspoken meaning. "I need you to trust me. When I say Things will change. Alina smiled softly, brushing off his words with a gentle wave of her hand, accustomed to minimizing her own importance, her own needs. Your recovery is what matters, Pa, she murmured, her voice soothing, reassuring. Don't worry about anything else. But Mr. Whitmore wasn't a man to make empty promises, to offer platitudes. His words lingered in the air, heavy with unspoken intent, carrying a weight far greater than she could have possibly realized. A week later, the Whitmore family received an unexpected summons, an official request that sent ripples of unease and curiosity through their carefully ordered lives. Mr. Whitmore had asked everyone, Mark, Evelyn, Nathan, Claire, to meet him at his lawyer's office downtown, a formal, almost theatrical gesture that was completely uncharacteristic of his usual private, understated demeanor. The request was vague, the purpose unspecified, and it sparked a bewildering mix of curiosity, suspicion, and a growing sense of unease among the family members. Even Alina was surprised, caught off guard, when Mr. Whitmore insisted, with an uncharacteristic firmness, that she accompany him. I need you there, Alina, he stated, his voice leaving no room for argument, his gaze unwavering. Trust me. When they arrived at the sleek glass-walled office building downtown, the atmosphere was palpably tense, charged with unspoken anxieties.